Hi! In this video I want to show you some techniques you can use for creating stereo width and stereo movement in a modular system without actually using any stereo effects. I have been using some of these techniques for years when mixing in a DAW. Some of them are new, and a few of them are only possible if you have a mid-side processor like HAAS 2 from Joranalogue Audio Design. But only a few, I promise. For the most part, you will only need a stereo mixer and at least a mono delay or a mono reverb, and probably some stackables or mults as well. Now, first of all, before I do anything else, I want to explain to you what LCR mixing is. LCR mixing literally just means left, center, right mixing. And it's a technique that's used by a lot of mixing engineers, and it's the easiest, most basic and most useful technique I can share with you. Years I struggled with panning. Knowing just how much to pan every layer of sound was like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while completely colorblind. It was just a guessing game until I realized that all I needed to do was pan things either completely to the left, dead center, or completely to the right, and try to balance the amount of energy on both sides. And that's it. Pan everything hard left, hard right, or don't pan at all. And when you don't have anything to balance out either side, then you can use some of the techniques explained in this video to fill up that empty space. Let's have a listen to some patches I made for this video. To demonstrate the first technique, I made a really basic patch. There's a bass, some chords, and a little melody or arpeggio. I want to keep the bass and the melody in the center, but I want to make the chords really wide. What you can very easily do in a DAW is just copy the track, pan the first one hard left, the second one hard right, and use complementary EQs on both sides. After all, the perception of a wide stereo sound comes from the fact that there's small differences between the two sides. Now, I don't have enough modules to create a copy of these chords. Neither do I have one, let alone two parametric equalizers in my rack. And I don't have a fancy mixer with equalizers on it. But what I do have is a bandpass filter. And that's all I need. So I've made 2 extra copies of these chords. The first one is panned hard to the left and the second copy is panned hard to the right. But as you can hear, it's still a mono sound, and the left and the right speaker produce exactly the same sound. So let's change that using my complementary EQ contraption. The third copy of my chord sound is sent to the bandpass filter. To create this kind of EQ, I will mix my dry sound with this bandpass sound, and I do this by simply plugging the bandpass sound straight into my mixer. Let's listen to the left side only. So on one track there's the dry sound of the chords coming in, and another track panned to the same side, to the left, I have the bandpass coming in. For the other side, I've melted the output of the bandpass filter, inverted it, and I've sent it to another track on the mixer, panned hard to the right. Now if I unmute everything, you'll hear that there's a nice white stereo image. And you might notice there's some modulation on the bandpass filter, but even when I remove this, you can hear there's a stereo width to the sound. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm mixing together the dry sound and the bandpass sound to create a kind of bump in my EQ. And by inverting the bandpass signal and mixing that with the dry sound, I create a kind of notch at the same frequency as the bump on the other side. Let's have a look at the HAAS effect to create a sense of direction in the stereo field. The HAAS effect is named after Helmut Haas, who did extensive research on the previously discovered precedence effect described in 1949 by a team led by Hans Wallach, who was a German-American experimental psychologist. Wallach and his team discovered that when you play two identical sounds right after each other, the sound is perceived as one sound. When the delay between the two sounds is small enough, and I'm talking about delays up to 40 milliseconds, human hearing can't distinguish the two from each other. If the delay is too long, the second sound is perceived just as an echo. Helmut Haas was researching the effects of a single echo on the eligibility of human speech, and most importantly for us, he did this research using a stereo setup. In 1951, Helmut Haas published his findings in a PhD called Über den Einfluss eines Einfachechos auf die Hörsamkeit von Sprache, in which he describes in great detail how he used a set of stereo speakers to play back an identical signal, but by adding a short delay to the signal on either side, the listener will perceive one sound coming from a very distinct direction instead of two separate signals. This technique makes clever use of the way our brains process stereo sounds in a room and only works with very short delays. The impact of this psychoacoustic effect greatly exceeds the impact of just using panning, and when we modulate the time of the delay, it's possible to create a sense of movement in the stereo field. In the example you're listening to right now, I used this technique together with a pair of modulated filters, one for each side, and at times it really feels as if the sound is orbiting your head. Let me show you how it works. Here I have the same sound going through the first two channels of my Cosmics. One is panned hard left, and the other one is panned hard right. The right one is going through the Erica Synths Pico Bucket Brigade delay, but it's currently bypassed. So this is the sound without the delay. Before I bring in the delay, if you want to try this effect, you have to turn the feedback completely down. And you also have to use a complete wet signal. Let me bring it in. Let's compensate for the volume drop a little bit. And changing the delay time changes the directionality of the sound. Let me patch in a sequence coming from Mimetic Digitalis to modulate the time. For short sounds, the maximum delay time you can get away with is anything below 5 milliseconds. But for complexer sounds, you can go up to 14 milliseconds. And if you add a reverb, you can even get away with times up to 100 milliseconds. Let me patch in the spring reverb to the aux end of my mixer. Let's bring in the spring reverb. Of course, I have to turn up the sense. And now let's turn up the time on the Bucket Brigade delay. This trick is primarily used by mixing engineers when mixing mono instruments like a guitar that have to serve as the main bass for the vocalist or solo instruments. Think of acoustic guitar chords with a singer on top. The way to add stereo spread without just reverting to stereo effects is just like in the previous example, use two copies of the same track, one dry and panned to one side, and another one completely wet, panned to the other side. You can really use any kind of mono effect, but reverbs, delays, or choruses or phasers, something like that, work best. In this patch, I've split the plug sound coming from braids into channel 3 and 4 on my mixer. The dry signal is panned to the right, and the wet signal, which is a delay with some time modulation, is panned completely to the left. And you can hear how this greatly enhances the feeling of width. Now, this trick is also used a lot when mixing two guitars together, and this can even be used on heavy distorted guitars, so it really works for just about anything. The key to this is to pan the sounds to separate sides and pan the effects to the opposite sides. Let me show you. Let's mute the wet signal, So this is just a dry sound coming from braids, and it's panned to the right. And here I have another dry signal panned completely to the left. And this of course has already a lot of stereo information because the two completely different sounds are panned hard left and hard right. But we can even enhance the feeling of width when we use the trick I explained a minute ago on both instruments. So there's the pluck sound coming from braids, it's panned hard to the right, and the wet sound is panned to the left. Then I have a dry sound coming from channel 3, and that's panned to the left, the same side as the effect on the braids sound. And let me unmute the wet version of the sound coming from channel. And I realize it's really confusing when I explain it like this, but an easier way to look at it is that each side has a dry signal and a wet signal of the other sound. When mixing music, it's generally a good idea to leave your bass instruments in the center and put some kind of high-pass filter on the sides. This is not only because the bass and the kick drum have so much energy, it's best to spread this energy across two speakers, but also has to do with the physical properties of sound and the way we process directional sound in our day-to-day lives. High frequencies carry a lot more information about where it's actually coming from. That's why the beeps from cars or trucks that are backing up are generally rather high in pitch. But instead of beeps, they really should be using white noise, as that's a lot less intrusive and has a much more obvious directionality. To create some clarity and an enhanced stereo spread in a DAW, you would normally use a mid-side EQ with a low cut on the sides, somewhere around 200 to 300 Hz. But I want to show you how to mimic this in a modular system without mid-side processing. And while being not a true mid-side technique, because we will just use left mid right panning, it's possible to create some stereo spread in the high frequencies and a tighter, less muddy low end. In this patch I used the kick drum setting on braids, sequenced by Mosquat 2, and modulated by a few LFOs and Mimetic Digitalis to create this groove. So this is the patch without any processing or panning. We're only listening to the center sound here. And now if you listen to this patch, you will notice there is a much wider stereo spread. To create this movement, I use the low-pass filter on the centered sound to remove just a little bit of the top end. Actually, the sound is going through a ripples filter, but it's completely open. But even while it's open, it takes a little bit of the high end, and that's just enough. So channel 2 on my Cosmics is the centered sound, which is going through the low-pass filter. Now let me bring up channel 1 and 3. Notice how channel 1 is panned hard to the left and channel 3 is panned hard to the right. And these channels are actually the exact same sound as before, but going through two separate high-pass filters. This is just to remove the bottom end from the panned signals. So the centered signal has reduced highs, and the panned signals have reduced lows. So this is how it sounds at this point. Please keep in mind that none of this is mid-side processing, and there's equal amounts of energy going through the left and right speakers. To really make this work, you need to modulate the high-pass filters. In this patch I used Orbit 3, but you can use any kind of modulation you want. Let me bring up this modulation. The most important thing for this modulation is that you try to send modulation to both filters in such a way that when the frequency is going up on the left one, it's going down on the right one. You could just use an LFO and the inverted version for it for the left and the right sides. That would work just perfectly fine. And for this kind of thing, LFOs that are out of phase to each other are really interesting. Now when I add a spring reverb, you'll notice how things really start sounding cavernous. And by the way, you're not restricted to low LFOs for the modulation of the high-pass filters. You can go up into low audio rate for really interesting effects. And you can play around with the levels, of course. In this patch, I heavily rely on the HAAS effect to create some stereo movement. I've used a delay on both left and right sides. These delays are set to really short times, and the times are slightly modulated by unrelated slow LFOs. And I've routed the output of my mixer through Enhance 2. And as you can see here, at the top of Enhance 2, very rarely there's a red LED firing up. And this indicates phase-related problems. And you might have noticed that the balance knob on Enhance 2 is slightly to the left. This is just because the left channel of this synth had a little more energy than the right one. Now let's introduce some mid-side processing. To create this sound, I've routed the mid output on Enhance 2 to Paradigm which is an overdrive distortion module by Cosmotronic, and the output of Paradigm is going back into the mid input on Enhanced 2. The side output on Enhanced 2 is going through a spring reverb and back into the side input. And by processing the mids and the sides with a different processor or effect, you can create a really cool stereo image, even though these effects are mono. Please remember that whenever you're using mid-side processing, the signal going in has to have some stereo information in it, because if not, there wouldn't be any sides and you wouldn't be able to process them separately. For this example, I zoomed out a little bit so you can see the whole system and get an idea of what's going on. Pan to the center, or not panned at all. There's a sound coming from even VCO. It's just off screen. It's going through the Synthesystem VCF. It's just a mixture of a saw wave and a triangle for some extra low end. The sequence is coming from Mosquad 2, and I'm using the envelopes from Mets to send over to the filter and to the VCA here. Then I have one generate pan to the left. It's receiving the same sequence from Mosquad 2. I'm using the first channel of the dual ADSR for the filter and the VCA on the filter. Pan to the right, I have the second generate. It's receiving the exact same sequence from Mosquad 2. I'm using channel 2 on the ADSR for the filter and the VCA on the filter as well. And when these three play together, the centered even VCO and the two hard pan generate threes, there's already a wide stereo image, because there's always minute changes, and I made sure of that, to the filter settings and the envelopes. So left and right are not exactly the same sound. And by the way, there's also a little bit of phase modulation going to both generates, and for that I'm using the Cinnamon in self oscillation. And just as in the previous patch, I routed the stereo output of my mixer. Actually is going through Messer, which is a compressor. I'll activate it later. So the stereo output of this synth mix is going into the two inputs on Enhanced 2 and is going out to my interface. Now on these cables, this is a send going to my MA35, and it's mixed with the dry signal in the mix mode attenuator mixer, but the signal from the MA35 is inverted, so it kind of acts like a phaser, although I don't have a bandpass filter, but it sounds okay. So that's going through the filter and the mix mode. Let me use it on the side channel first. So the side is going through this phaser-like contraption and back into Enhanced 2. And even though this is all in mono, you can get a sense of stereo, you can hear it better, and I turn up the rate of the modulation going to the filter. Now you might think that you need to process the sides to get a stereo image, and that's not true. You can also do this with the mid channel. Let me change over to a high pass filter so it, when it's inverted, filters out the highs. And as you can hear, you can just as well process the mid signal with a mono effect, and even that creates a stereo image. Let me switch over this processing to the sides. Again, switch this one. Let's introduce some drums and a compressor. And I seriously recommend you listen to this using headphones, because if you do, you'll hear clearly how the phasing kind of sound travels from the left ear to the right ear. It's a really cool effect. Thanks, by the way, to DivKit for showing this in great detail in the video about the wrong module, left, right, mid-side, left, right. There's a lot of examples of mid-side processing in that video. The cool thing with Enhance 2 is that you have these tilt EQs to filter out some bottom end from the sides, which is really helpful when you actually want to create a nice sounding mix inside your modular. In this patch, the core output of my first Generate 3 is centered on a mixer. To the left is the full output of my first Generate 3, and it's panned slightly to the left, let's say 10 o'clock. Panned to about 2 o'clock, so to the right is the full output of the second Generate 3. Everything together sounds like this. Stereo output of my mixer is going into the stereo inputs on Mesor for some sidechain compression, and the stereo outputs of Mesor are connected to the stereo ins on Enhance 2. Stereo outputs of Enhance 2 are connected to the U-jack. This is going into the sound card. My drums, by the way, are recorded on a separate input of my interface. And now I'll use these two cables to insert several effects into the side channel on Enhance 2. So the purple cable is going back into Enhance 2 and the orange one is coming out. Let's try a filter. Let's use the bandpass on the Cinnamon. Okay, sounds nice. Let's try the spring reverb. circuit brigade delay. Now let's try the DPLR delay. This is a stereo delay, but I'm only using one output. Let's try the phaser from the Pico DSP, which is also a stereo effect, but I'm only using the left output. Let's try Paradigm for some modulated distortion. I'm modulating the internal ring modulator with an LFO from Frequency Central Wave Runner, and it's synced to the clock. Let's try a ring modulator. Actually, let's try this on the mid channel too. I wonder how it sounds. Whoa. Back to the side channel. Let's try the fold here. And I'll use the alternative output. Hear how that sounds like when we process the mid channel through it. Whoa. Notice how it's giving some problems. Remove the modulation. Sounds awesome. Yeah, I hadn't tried this before. Yeah, I have to remember this one. Okay, let's try the bucket brigade delay again. Let's turn down the feedback a little bit. Sounds weird. Okay. Let's try the filter again. Let me try the synthesis system. So you can hear when I unplug these cables, we're only listening to the side channel. Notice how it's a lot quieter. And that's almost always the case when you're processing mid-side information. The sides are usually really much more silent than the mid. Let's try the phaser again. Sounds nice. Let's try the spring reverb. That actually sounds a lot better than when I use the sides to go through the spring reverb. Okay. Let's try this one for a moment. I bet it's going to be loud. This is a really nice overdrive. Let me modulate the harmonics. Yeah, I really think this module sounds great. Really versatile too. The DPLR. Now, I think this sounds a little bit silly. Nonetheless, it's a cool effect. Just to make sure I'm not forgetting my MA35. Let's use that for a moment. The technique used to create the white sound in this jam is rather self-explanatory. I've used a chord sound from braids, which being shaped and filtered by the MA35 filter, and this is going straight into the mixer, but I've copied the signal with stackables into my bucket brigade delay and my DPLR delay. And while the main sound is centered on the mixer, the output of the bucket brigade delay is panned hard to the left and the output of the DPLR is panned hard to the right. I'm going to leave it at this for this video. You can use these techniques on a single voice or one sound or on a complete mix if you want. I also want to thank Joran for borrowing me his enhanced tube to use for this video. I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.